everyone. I am about to discuss WH constructions. I am Maria Desiree Q. Guillermo, your reporter. First, we are going to summarize the diagnostic properties of WH movement. First, we have WH movement leaves a gap. This is simply the observation that the copy of a moved WH element, its trace is left unpronounced, both in direct and indirect questions. Example number 1A. What did Bill see? What did you say that Bill saw? Next, the distance between a WH phrase and the gap can be arbitrarily large. WH movement is unbounded in the sense that it can cross over CP boundaries, even we know that in reality, movement proceeds in short steps. This is the fact that the trace can be left in a complement clause of a complement clause of a complement clause, etc. Example 3A. What does Sue think that you said that Bill saw? What does Bill suspect that Sue thinks that you said that saw? Next, WH movements obeys the subjacency condition. That is, it obeys all the constraints subsumed under the subjacency condition. WH movement exhibits funny effects with subject extraction. We have called these effects complementizer trace or comp trace. WH movement shows what is called the strong crossover effect. When we discussed the condition on pronominal binding, we saw that a pronoun can be interpreted as a bound pronoun when it has a quantified antecedent which C commands it. Example, everyone thinks you like him for all. X thinks you like X. 5. I told no one that you like X. WH phrases behave like other quantified antecedents in this respect. We only look at the bound pronoun. Who thinks that you like him for which? X. X thinks you like X. Who did you tell that you liked him? For which? X you tell that you liked X. There are contexts, though, in which a pronoun cannot be bound by a WH phrase. These contexts are contexts where a WH phrase crosses over a pronoun, as you can see in example number 8. In this type of context, the pronoun cannot be bound by the WH phrase. In example number 8, cannot receive the following interpretation. Not that this interpretation is expressed by example number 6. Okay, refer to example number 9. In example number 8, the pronoun C commands the trace of the WH phrase who, and this context pronominal binding fails. This context is called strong crossover. Next, strong crossover. A bound pronoun cannot C command a WH trace. We would like to find out why number 10 or example number 10 holds. A simple hypothesis is that a WH trace counts as an R expression and is the subject of principle C of the binding theory. The strong crossover effect would thus follow in the same way as the fact that he and John cannot be co-indexed. In example number 11, he thinks that Mary saw John. The status of 11 follows from principle C of the binding theory. Number 12, who does he think Mary saw? He thinks Mary saw someone. He thinks Mary saw the bastard. He thinks Mary saw John. So, no new principle is needed, but now we can use the strong crossover prohibition to see if we have a WH trace somewhere. The presence of such a trace should trigger a principle C violation if we choose the right kind of example. We have here relative clauses. Relative clauses involve WH movement. The formation of a relative clause clearly involves WH phrase in many cases, but not in all cases. To distinguish these WH phrases from the WH phrases occurring in interrogatives, the latter are often called interrogatives, while the former are called relative WH phrases or pronouns in the case of WH words. Relative clauses in example number 13. You were talking to the man who I introduced to you. I bought the book which I told you about. This is the room where Bill keeps his drum set. And that was the time when Mary decided to quit her job. It is also clear that corresponding to this WH phrase, there is a gap in the relative clause indicated by blank. It is thus natural to postulate that the WH phrase is in specifier complementizer phrase of the relative clause and moved there by WH movement. We should therefore find all the properties of WH movement before we proceed. Note that we have the WH phrase co-indexed with the head NP to indicate how the relative clause is interpreted. Roughly, the man ISO means the man, such that ISO this very man. The WH phrase, which we will term, following traditional usage, a relative pronoun or a WH relative pronoun, is plausibly generated at the gap position and moved to the specifier complementizer phrase. The gap itself is the trace. We will conclude that this process, call it relative clause information, is indeed a cause of WH movement. In example number 14, you were talking to the man who I introduced to you. Letter B, I bought the book which I told you about. This is the room where Bill keeps her drum set. D, that was the time when Mary decided to quit her job. It is clear that movement of the WH relative pronoun is unbounded. We have here the WH island. Refer to example number 15. The man who I wondered who introduced to, and the book which I know who told you about, and the room where Bill asked what kept, the time when Mary wonders why she decided to quit her job. Complex NP constraint or the noun complement. We have here example number 16. The man who I heard the claim that I introduced to you. Next, the book which you forgot the fact that I told you about. In complex NP constraint or the relative clauses, we have here example number 17. I introduced the man to the woman. A, the woman I introduced the man to who? The woman who I introduced the man to. Sentential subject constraint. Example number 21. The man who that I introduced to you annoyed Bill. The book which that I told you about surprised Sue. In left branch constraint, we have here examples. The man whose I introduced mother to you. The book whose I told you about cough. Compare with cases where the whole constituent is pied. The man whose mother I introduced to you. The book whose over I told you about. Comp-trace effects. We can easily illustrate that relative clause formation triggers them. In example 24, the man who you think left early. The man who you think left early. Strong crossover effects. Similarly, we can show the presence of strong crossover effects. The man who thinks Mary saw him the man who thinks Mary saw. The second sentence cannot have he co-indexed with who and its trace t. It is of course fine if he has a different index than who. We have verified that relative clause formation has all the properties of WH movement and is therefore a case of WH movement. However, in some cases or relative clauses, there is no relative pronoun at all. Here are examples of relative clauses in English without a WH phrase relative pronoun. You were talking to the man that I introduced to you. I bought the book that I told you about. In these structures, that still seems to be the complementizer but not the WH phrase itself. Note that that is optional as the complementizer often is. We have here example 27. You were talking to the man who introduced me to you. Letter B. You were talking to the man who I told you about. Note the C sentence with the subject WH phrase. In this case, the complementizer must be present in standard American English. This is another funny subject extraction effect that we'll not deal with here. There can be piped material when the WH relative pronoun is not present. For example, prepositions cannot be piped. They must be stranded if possible. Refer to example number 28. You were talking to the man to whom I introduced you. You were talking to the man who I introduced you to. Nor can be a bigger DP or the determiner phrase be piped if the gap is its subject. Example 29. You were talking to the man that I introduced mother to you. I bought the book that I told you about. Over. A. Is relative clause formation without a relative pronoun an instance of WH movement? If we run through all the examples showing that relative clause formation with a relative pronoun is WH movement, examples number 15 to 25, and systematically erase the relative pronoun, we will find that the presence of the relative pronoun changes nothing at all except for piping noted above in the funny subject effect. On the other hand, we want to treat these cases as involving WH movement. There is no WH phrase involved at all. Very simply, we will say that WH relative pronouns can be silent. That is a WH phrase that has no phonetic content. Just as pronouns can be silent in infinitives. For example, the pro, read big pro, or certain CS or the silent that, or TS when it is present in English, or the silent, the plural version of English, a, for example, the plural indefinite determiner. Relative pronouns are the exact equivalent of the DPs who are who or what. These are often denoted OP for relative operator, another way of terming WH phrases, or DP plus WH who. So, OP equals DP plus WH who or what, with silence indicated with capital letters. Here are some examples where what moves up to the specifier complementizer phrase is silent operator OP. Refer to example number 30. You were talking to the man that I introduced to you, and I bought the book that I told you about. Although we can't see the empty operator, we can tell that it has moved to the highest specifier complementizer phrase position, which is where the overt WH phrases go. What is significant in this context is that relative clauses with silent operators also obey all the diagnostic properties of WH movement. For example, the island constraints, etc. Doubly filled comp filter. For example, the man who saw you, pronounced WH silent C. B, the man that you saw, silent OP, pronounced C. The man you saw, silent OP, silent C. And the man who that you saw, pronounced OP, pronounced C. The forms that is excluded has both a pronounced WH phrase and a pronounced C. this configuration should be excluded. We can state what is excluded in the following filter, which is called the doubly filled comp filter, or the comp here refers to C, not to complement. Doubly filled C or comp filter, WH phrase that, where both the WH and that are pronounced. Note that this filter will also account for the following impossible indirect question in English. For example, I wonder who if John saw. We can thus let WH movement operate freely. Let elements be silent or pronounced in complementizer phrase. The effects of illicit combinations can be ruled out by filters that apply to the output structures, as was suggested in a different context in Perlmutter in 1970. Direct questions are questions in matrix clauses that are almost always tense. However, we saw that indirect questions in English can either be tensed or infinitive clauses. We have here example number 34. A. I don't know whether if you left early. I wonder whether if you left early. I ask you whether if you left early. I don't know whether if Big Pro to leave early. I wonder whether if to leave early. I ask you whether if to leave early. Since relative clauses are adjunct clauses, we expect that they also could, in principle, be either tensed or infinitival clauses. Are there then infinitival relative clauses? The answer is positive. In 36, A. I finally met a man with whom to dance. This is the only room in which to keep your drums. That was the time at which to start packing. Meaning that construction state, for example, we can paraphrase the C sentence as meaning, this was the time at which one should start packing. In other words, pro is interpreted as meaning one or anyone, the so-called arbitrary interpretation of pro. Secondly, there is an idea of should as well, and it is an interesting question where this bit of meaning comes from, since there is no word or morpheme that seems to introduce it. We can show that infinitival relatives meet all the relevant properties, qualifying them as WH movement constructions, even though for some properties it is difficult because they are subject to all sorts of additional poorly understood restrictions. These relatives, just like tensed relatives, may occur without an overt WH relative pronoun. Refer to example number 37. Here is a great book for Bill to read. B. I am looking for a candidate for Bill to vote for. And letter C. A man to fix the sink is hard to find. Unlike the case of tense relatives, however, there cannot be an overt WH relative pronoun if the phrase in specifier complementizer phrase is a simple WH determiner phrase. Example number 38. Letter A, here is a great book which for Bill to read. Letter B, I am looking for a candidate who for Bill to vote for, and a man who to fix the sink is hard to find. Here is another example. Here is a great room in which for Bill to rest. Here is a great room in which to rest. Here is a great room for Bill to rest in. Here is a great room to rest in. Either there is a C4 or an overt WH phrase in which, but not both. The promotion analysis of relative clauses in the sentences below, what is called the head NP of the relative clause, is involved. Notice that this notion of head is not the same as the X-bar theoretic notion of head. Number 4, letter A, I bought the book about food, which I told you about. I bought the book that I told you about. You were talking to the man that I introduced to you. How do we decide if it is movement? If it is movement, the head NP was inside the relative clause earlier in the derivation. Otherwise, the head NP was never there. In Vergnaud 1974, Jean Roger Vergnaud, pictured here, develops argument to the effect that the head was inside the relative clause earlier in the derivation, at least in some cases of relative clauses. Below is one of the most famous arguments based on the properties of idioms. We have here the idiom chunks. Example, Bill is aware of the significant headway that John made. This sentence is fine, but headway is an idiom chunk of the idiom make headway. Headway is selected as complement of made. If headway is what is generated inside the relative clause and moved out, then this is not surprising, otherwise it is unexpected. Another is the anaphor binding. Example, Bill liked the pictures of each other which they acquired yesterday. The sentence is fine. Each other needs to satisfy principle A. If the head of the relative or the underlined was inside the relative in the T position, then we can explain why this sentence is good. Principle A is satisfied before movement. If the head in bold was never inside the relative clause, we cannot explain this. In conclusion, the head NP can be moved out of the relative clause. This is called the promotion or raising analysis of relative clauses. Does this mean that the head is always moved out of the relative clause? The answer seems to be negative. For example, there is another kind of relative clause, which is usually written with a comma between the head and the relative clause. They are read with a special intonation, and the meaning of the relative clause is a comment about the head. You can add by the way, rather than a way to specify it further. We have here example number 46a. I bought a book which, by the way, I had told you about. You were talking to the man that I introduced to you. I bought a book that I told you about. These relative clauses are called non-restrictive relative clauses or appositive relative clauses. The others are called restrictive relative clauses. They disallow silent WH words as relative pronouns, and they disallow the kind of examples below. Number 47a. You were talking to a man that, by the way, I introduced to you last year. I bought several books that, by the way, I had told you about. Peter liked some pictures of each other, which, by the way, they acquired yesterday. Peter is aware of some significant headway, which, by the way, John had made recently. Another case of null operator movement, the Taft construction. In the Taft construction, it appears that object of an infinitival or lower clause has moved over the subject of its own clause to the subject position of the matrix clause. Example, Bill is tough to work with. This idea is easy to sell. The subject of tough is not necessarily a selected position. For example, a theta position. It tolerates expletives. Example, number 51a. It is tough to work with Bill. Letter B, it is easy to sell this idea. The subject of the infinitival can be an arbitrary plural, but it can also be an overt element. 52a, Bill is tough to work with. This idea is easy to sell. Bill is tough for me to work with. This idea is easy for me to sell. We would like to say that there is movement of the object of the infinitive verb to the subject of tough, but this is problematic since raising to subject does not do this. 54a, I am likely to work with Bill next year. It is likely for me to work with Bill next year. Bill is likely for me to work with next year. The movement can be long distance in English as long as the intermediate clauses are infinitival. Example number 55A. Bill is tough for me to want to work with. B. This idea is easy for me to try to sell. A one-step movement would violate the subjacency condition. Notice that we witness a strong crossover effect. Bill is tough for me to want him to work with. If we co-index him with Bill, the result is deviant, suggesting that the trace is like a WH trace. One general solution for this kind of construction is the following. There is movement, but for a silent operator or the WH word. A silent operator is merged as the object of the verb in the infinitive and moves up to the subordinate specifier complementizer phrase. It is co-indexed with the subject of tough. Example 57A. Bill is tough to work with. This idea is easy to sell. 58A. Bill is tough for me to want to work with. And B. This idea is easy for me to try to sell. The proposal that there is a movement from the subordinate object to the subordinate specifier complementizer phrase is strengthened by the fact that the tough construction obeys the island constraints. In WH Islands, example number 60A, Bill is tough for me to wonder how to work with. This idea is easy for me to ask to sell. In complex NP constraint or the noun complement, Bill is tough for me to spread the excitement to work with. This idea is easy for me to plan a strategy to sell. In 62, complex NP constraint or the relative clause, Bill is tough for me to make the time to work with. This idea is easy for me to visit the convention to sell in. Coordinate structure constraint. Bill is tough for me to work with and enjoy my job. In letter B, this idea is easy for me to have some confidence in sell. In sentential subject constraint, Bill is tough. Example number 64A, Bill is tough for me to work with, to be pleasant. This idea is easy for me to sell, to annoy everyone. Tropicalization and left dislocation are very similar constructions in which a constituent from inside a clause appears close initially. In tropicalization, this constituent has a corresponding gap in its expected position. In left dislocation, there is a pronoun that corresponds to the left dislocated element. The term left dislocation, two different constructions with different properties, one of which is referred to as hanging topic dislocation construction, and the other is called clitic left or right dislocation, a term coming from the Romance languages but widely found even in languages that have no clitics. These two constructions are distinct in their intonational patterns and in their formal behavior. Here is an example of both constructions in French. Please refer to example number 65. And example number 66. When a pronoun is present, English only has the hanging topic construction. 67. The tropicalization example. A. Anchovies I like blank. B. Star Wars I watch blank often. Hanging topic left dislocation. Anchovies I like them. Star Wars I watch it often. The gap in tropicalization constructions corresponds to a trace. Subjacency effects in general serve as reliable diagnostics to determine movement, but some other of Ross's constraints do not. Example, the coordinate structure constraint. Here, we see that tropicalization obeys the island constraints and shows other properties of WH movement. But the hanging topic constructions does not obey the island constraints. In WH Island, tropicalization, example, anchovies, I don't know who likes. Star Wars, Bill wonders how often I watch. In example number 70, we have here the left dislocation. Letter A, anchovies, I don't know who likes them. B, Star Wars, Bill wonders how often I watch it. Complex NP constraint or the noun complement. Tropicalization, anchovies, I believe the claim that he likes. Star Wars, Bill heard the rumor that I watch often. In left dislocation, anchovies, I believe the claim that he likes them. Star Wars, Bill heard the rumor that I watch it often. In complex NP constraint, we have here tropicalization A, anchovies, I believe the claim that he likes. Star Wars, Bill heard the rumor that I watch often. In left dislocation, anchovies, I believe the claim that he likes them. Star Wars, Bill heard the rumors that I watch it often. In complex NP constraint or the relative clause, please refer to the following example. 73, tropicalization. And in number 74, the left dislocation. And the subordinate structure constraint. Tropicalization, anchovies, I think Bill likes and drinks wine. Star Wars, I watch often and admire George Lucas. In left dislocation, anchovies, I think Bill likes them and drinks wine. Star Wars, I watch it often and admire George Lucas. In sentential subject constraint, we have here tropicalization. Example number 77, anchovies that I like surprises everyone. Star Wars that I watch often is a known. And in left dislocation, 78A, anchovies that I like them surprises everyone. And Star Wars that I watch it often is a well-known fact. In left branch constraint, we have here example A, John's I like mother. Sue, I hate attitude. In left dislocation, example ATA, John, I like his mother. B, Sue, I hate her attitude. So far, we have assumed that tropicalization moves the topic to a position adjunct to TP. Current thinking at the time of writing 2013 on the matter suggests instead that such moved topics are in specifier complementizer phrase of a special kind of C to host a topic. Example, selects for a topic as its specifier. Here we notate it C plus topic, but it is often notated as top heading a top view. The hanging topic is not moved, it is directly merged in a clause initial position, in fact, before WH phrases. In 82A, what John, when did you see him? When John did you see him? This suggests an analysis where the hanging topic is outside the CP. To make things concrete, we can treat it as an adjunct to the CP. We have here example, WH movement constructions, WH questions, direct and indirect, relative clauses. A, headed restrictive and non-restrictive relatives, infinitival relatives. C, free relatives or headless relatives. We have here example number 83, I will buy whatever you buy. I like who you met yesterday. Whenever John visits, he is hungry. A last and interesting case of WH constructions is the following. When did Mary say that he jumped? This sentence is ambiguous the same way WH questions are ambiguous. Recall that when the WH phrase is an adjunct or adverbial, the trace ensures that the interpretation will be constructed with the right clause. When did Mary say that he jumped? A. When did Mary say that he jumped? B. When did Mary say that he jumped? When did Mary say that? When did he jump? According to Mary, we find the same ambiguity depending on where the trace is. John jumped before Mary said he jumped. 89. John jumped before Mary said he jumped. This sentence could be truthfully uttered if John jumped on Tuesday at 5 p.m. earlier than the time, say 7 p.m., at which he jumped according to Mary. This corresponds to the first structure. This sentence could also be truthfully uttered if John jumped on Tuesday at 5 p.m. earlier than the time, say 7 p.m., at which Mary said something, even if what she said is, John jumped at 3 p.m. That is earlier than when he actually jumped. Responds to the first structure because John jumped earlier than when Mary spoke. This shows that the silent OP really is silent when, since the silent when is a specifier complementizer phrase. This also shows that before and after CP complementizer phrase complements with a silent that and silent OP. That's end my report. Thank you for listening.